Welcome to Train Signal. This is the Managing BranchCache lesson in the Windows 7 Administration Training course. In this lesson, you'll learn about how you manage BranchCache on the Windows 7 side of the BranchCache equation. We'll start by talking about what some BranchCache is all about, understanding BranchCache. We'll move on to talk about a couple of requirements that are in place in order for BranchCache on the client side to operate. Next, we'll talk about BranchCache operating modes, and we'll talk about a special mode called local cache mode that's really not used that often, but I want you to know about. I'll then show you a BranchCache operational diagram for the two primarily used BranchCache operating modes. And then I'll show you how you can manage BranchCache using group policy on the Windows 7 side of the house. Another way to manage BranchCache is through the use of the net shell command, or netsh, and we'll be talking about how to use that command to manage a number of BranchCache settings on the Windows 7 client side as well. And we'll wrap up the lesson by showing you a couple of ways that you can monitor BranchCache activity on your Windows 7 client. As you know, Global Mantix has a number of small regional offices that some have relatively slow connections to the internet. Corporate IT has become concerned with ever-increasing bandwidth costs related to constant communication with headquarters. This includes 20 computers at a branch office all having to download the same relatively large file from a corporate IT server located at headquarters. BranchCache will help alleviate that by caching that content locally on a very transparent basis, and we'll talk about that in a minute. For now, the Global Mantix CIO has decided that all smaller regional sites will use distributed mode BranchCache, which is the mode we're covering in this lesson, as it's the mode most often used by pure Windows 7 networks. Larger regional offices will eventually use hosted mode BranchCache, but we will not be doing too much with hosted mode BranchCache in this lesson. From a business need perspective, BranchCache will increase employee productivity by reducing the time it takes to download items. Further, bandwidth costs will be reduced because a lot of content will end up being cached locally and not have to be downloaded over and over a small internet connection. So what is BranchCache? Well, first of all, BranchCache is a brand new feature found in both Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 R2. The service does not work at all in older versions of Windows, so you really have to have the brand new infrastructure to take full advantage of BranchCache. The feature caches remote content onto your local computers and basically speeds up access to information, and that reduces bandwidth costs and personnel costs, both lowering total cost of ownership for the overall computing environment and increasing efficiency across the board. Best of all, BranchCache is completely transparent to the end user. It automatically activates when latency to a file hosting server exceeds 80 milliseconds, and this is definable via group policy. I've seen BranchCache described as a black box, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. What that means is that it's just that transparent to the end user. They truly don't know that anything's happening behind the scenes. BranchCache is not intended to be a high availability mechanism, but what it is intended to do is make it easier and faster for people to get content from a remote server. There are some requirements for BranchCache, particularly as they are associated with the lesson we're going to talk about. First of all, you need a working configured BranchCache server somewhere in the organization. This has to be a Windows Server 2008 R2 Enterprise or Data Center server. Configuring the BranchCache server is beyond the scope of this course. It's a server-side deployment that can be complex depending on how you set it up, and it is beyond the scope of this course. However, see the My Favorite Supporting Resources slide at the end of this lesson to get more information for configuring a BranchCache server. On the client side, you have to have Windows 7 Enterprise or Ultimate. No other versions of Windows 7 will support the BranchCache feature set. BranchCache operates in one of three what are called operating modes. Hosted cache mode uses a BranchCache-enabled server at a remote location to cache content from a central site. Clients at this remote location obtain their content from this caching server, which in turn obtains its content from a central server, basically at GlobalMantic's headquarters. The only time clients will actually get their content from that local server, however, is if the server actually has the content that they want. If it doesn't, the content will be acquired from the original server. Again, this is all completely behind the scenes. The user has no idea this is even going on. The local system that they're working on, the Windows 7 system, is actually checking with all of these systems behind the scenes and saying, okay, who has what? Tell me who has what, and I'm going to get it from the most obvious location or the most efficient location, either from the cache if it has it, or I'm going to get it from a central server somewhere in the organization. Distributed cache mode is ideal for small offices. General Microsoft guidance, if you look at some of their documentation, indicates this is a site with fewer than 50 people. Distributed cache mode negates the need for a dedicated branch server. Everything happens with the central server that's running BranchCache at GlobalMantic's headquarters. Each Windows 7 client maintains its own cache, and other clients can request the data via network broadcasts. So what happens in this case is when a user requests a file, the Windows 7 machine screams out on the network, hey, does anybody have this? If they do, then the Windows 7 machine will simply get that file from another machine on the same network. If, however, all the machines say, nope, they got nothing, go fish, then they're going to redirect that result to a central server, and they're going to get it just like they would in a traditional file server network. So in this case, again, it's all totally transparent. The Windows 7 machine is out there talking on the network to these other machines saying, do you have what this person needs? If you don't, I'm just going to go get it the normal way. And that's pretty cool. There is a third BranchCache operating mode called local cache mode. When this mode is enabled, the local client does cache files that it uses from a central server. However, these files are only used by the local client. None of the cache information is shared with other systems. This mode could be useful in relatively secure environments where you really don't want a lot of people having pieces of information sitting around on their machines and all that good stuff, whether it's encrypted or not. You might not want to have a bunch of this information sitting around on a number of machines, and that's where one way that local cache mode could be useful. Frankly, I haven't seen a lot of really compelling use cases for local cache mode, but it is available in BranchCache if you want to use it. There are a couple of ways that you can manage BranchCache, and the first one is group policy. We've talked about group policy for a number of other things in this course, and we're going to be talking about it briefly here again, but we're not going to manage BranchCache with group policy through our examples. We're going to use a different method since we've done a lot of group policy stuff already. However, available at computer configuration, administrative templates, network, BranchCache, you're going to find a number of BranchCache related settings. And those settings will help you enable BranchCache in different modes for use on the network and to enable the BranchCache service locally. The BranchCache service is disabled by default on a Windows 7 machine, so you actually have to proactively enable that service in order to be able to use its features. When you manage BranchCache with group policy, you have to make some manual changes to the built-in Windows firewall if you have it enabled. First of all, you have to enable inbound and outbound TCP port 80 traffic. If you're going to use BranchCache in distributed mode, you have to enable inbound and outbound UDP port 3702 traffic. And for hosted mode, you have to enable outbound TCP port 443 traffic. We've covered firewall rules in this course in the lesson entitled Protecting Windows 7. If you decide to manage BranchCache with group policy, make sure that you make those firewall changes or BranchCache simply won't operate. We're going to take a look at the BranchCache related group policies that are available in Windows 7 in just a second, but there's a couple in particular I wanted to bring your attention to. Then we're going to go over to a GlobalMantic's desktop, and we're going to take a look at all of the policies that are available. From a disk space perspective, BranchCache by default uses up to 5% of the available disk space on the system. So if you have a 1 terabyte disk, it's going to use 5% of that terabyte disk, or about 50 gigs, for caching documents from a centralized server. This policy name is called Set Percentage of Disk Space Used for Client Computer Cache. Now I mentioned earlier that the latency figure at which point BranchCache kicks in was 80 milliseconds. That's a default figure, and it's configurable to a pretty high value via a policy named Configure Branch Cache for Network Files. I mentioned there's a couple different ways to manage branch cache, and one is group policy. The other one is to use that netshell command, netsh. But if you have configured netsh and then you configure group policies later on, the group policy configured items will always trump the netsh configured items. The netsh items are good for configuring a single machine or a couple of machines, but when you start getting to a lot of machines, most people will start using group policy because it really does reduce administrative overhead. However, I do want to show you the netsh commands, as they're likely to be talked about on the 7680 exam, and they're good to understand anyway. So we're going to be talking about those in this lesson. I'm now going to move over to a Global Mantix desktop, and we're going to take a look at the group policy items that are configurable via the local group policy editor. I've already opened up the policy editor to the appropriate location in the local policy tree. And you're going to see that the first item here is not configured, and it's turn on branch cache. This is the first thing you have to do if you're going to use branch cache at all. Remember that I mentioned that by default, branch cache ships disabled. So if you want to turn branch cache on, you have to open this policy and enable branch cache. The next two items have to do with which configuration mode or which operating mode you're going to use branch cache in, distributed or hosted. Notice there is no option set for the local mode. The only way you can configure local cache mode is to use the netsh command. If you want to use branch cache in distributed cache mode, you need to open up the policy and choose enabled. And once you do that, you click OK, and you would enable branch cache in distributed cache mode at the next reboot. Hosted cache mode has a little bit of a different flavor here. When you enable hosted cache mode, you have to enter the location of the hosted cache. What this means is you have to specify the address of a branch cache server that's upstream from this machine. The address has to match the fully qualified domain name of the server specified and the certificate for the branch cache server. When you use branch cache in hosted cache mode, you have to use an SSL certificate in order to be able to make it work. So if you have configured your central branch cache server correctly, it will have an SSL certificate already associated with it. When you configure the branch cache hosted cache mode on a Windows 7 machine, you have to use the exact same fully qualified domain name that matches the SSL certificate that you've attached to the branch cache server. Configure branch cache for network files is the metric that at which point you can choose when branch cache kicks in. So if I open this up, you're going to see if I enable it, this is going to give me a round-trip network latency value in milliseconds above which network files must be cached in the branch office. The default figure is 80 milliseconds. If there's a round-trip delay of more than 80 milliseconds, branch cache is going to start kicking in and caching those files. Now, most networks these days are going to be pretty good, so if you have a pretty decent network, you're not going to hit the 80 millisecond barrier. However, if you do, then you're already covered. You don't have to worry about the delays. So the branch cache is going to kick in for you at that point and start caching content locally. You can make this a lower figure, but you can also bring this much higher. Maybe you don't want branch cache to kick in until 200 milliseconds. In that case, you can change this to 200, and branch cache won't kick in until that point. Now, the other thing you can do is force network files to be cached to computers in the branch office. To do that, you would set the network latency value to 0. If you wanted to completely disable caching, you would set the latency value to something you're never going to see, like 1,000,000. Because if you have 1,000,000 seconds of latency, well, you've got bigger problems anyway, so then you wouldn't need to worry about it at that point. So if you always want to cache, set this to 0. If you never want to cache, set this to some insanely high value. The final configuration option here in the local group policy editor is to set percentage of disk space used for client computer cache. By default, 5% of disk space is set aside for branch cache caching on the local computer. You can change this value to whatever you want. If you want to have a larger cache, you can set that to 50% if you like. If you want to have a smaller cache, you can do that as well. It doesn't really matter. It really depends on your own needs. For Global Mantics, 5% is more than appropriate. Here's where the fun part starts. Managing branch cache with NetSH. This is a command line shell that you can use to configure a number of networking components in Windows 7. The first command that you see on the screen, NetSH branch cache set service mode equals distributed, enables branch cache in distributed mode. When you do this, the firewall rules we talked about before are automatically created. You don't need to go back to the firewall and do anything manually. There are some other mode options that are available with NetSH branch cache, including NetSH branch cache set service mode local, which will create a local branch cache like we talked about before, hosted client, and hosted server. We're not all that interested in the hosted versions of branch cache in this lesson, so we're not going to do too much about those, but take a look on your screen because there's some configuration and syntax information for hosted client and hosted server modes. The next command is NetSH branch cache show status, and this shows the current status of the branch cache service. We're going to take a look at both of these commands right now. I want to go over to a Global Mantics desktop machine, and I'm going to execute NetSH branch cache set service mode equals distributed, and then I'm going to execute the show status command so that you can see that it's actually enabled. So I'm going to go to the Start menu, and I'm going to open up an administrative command prompt. I'm going to do the show status command first so you can see what we have. Service mode is disabled, and the current status is stopped. So we've got to fix that. So the command we're going to type is NetSH branch cache set service mode equals distributed. And notice that it does a number of things. It enables firewall rule group branch cache for content retrieval HTTP, branch cache peer discovery, which uses something called WSD, and that both succeeded. It sets the service start type to manual for the branch cache service, and it sets the service mode, which is going to be to distributed. Now, if I re-execute this show status command, you're going to see that we have the service mode set to distributed caching, and the current status is running. This is a good thing. The branch cache service is now running on this machine, so as it starts caching files, it can begin to distribute them back out to other clients as well, if it needs to cache files. If this machine never goes below 80 milliseconds or above 80 milliseconds for latency, not going to have any problems. We're never going to have to worry about caching files. And here's a couple of other commands I'd like to go over with you as well. The first command sets the cache size, and this is how much of the disk space that's going to be used by branch cache. Now the syntax here can be tricky, so let's go over this one first. NetSH branch cache set cache size equals 30, percent equals true. If you don't put the percent equals true, it will set your cache size to 30 as well. It will be 30 bytes. It will not be 30% of your disk space. So this percent equals true says, here's how you specify a percentage of disk space. If you want to omit percent equals true, you can specify a full size that you'd like to specify in bytes. So if I just set this to 30 and didn't put that other thing on, then you're going to end up with a 30 byte cache, which is not going to do a whole lot to help you. The branch cache show local cache command will show you the contents of the local branch cache cache. These words get really hard to say, by the way. That command will show you the contents of the local cache. And that can be useful if you're trying to do some troubleshooting down the line and you want to see what happens to be sitting in people's cache. The next command, NetSH branch cache SMB set latency 1000, would set the latency value to a value of 1000 milliseconds rather than the default of 80. What this would mean is there would have to be an absolutely horrendous internet connection before branch cache would kick in. I'm not actually going to do that. I'm going to set my latency a little lower. We'll say 50, so you can see how it all works. And here we are at a GlobalMantics desktop again. And for this company's purposes, they want to set their cache size to 30% of the hard disk space. So we're going to type netsh BranchCache. So we're going to manage the BranchCache service. Set cache size equals 30%, equals true. And now you're going to notice that the setting of the cache size succeeded. This is a good thing. We've modified the cache size on this system. Now, just to make sure, we're going to do netsh BranchCache show local cache. And what this command will do is it's going to show us how much active current cache size we have, which right now is 0, but what the maximum cache size can be for this disk. And that can be 30% of the hard disk space. So you can see that command actually did work. And we'll go back and we'll change this to 15, and then come back here and do local cache again. And you'll see that command actually does change the maximum cache size that's available for BranchCache. The local cache location that you're seeing at the bottom option here is basically the default location for the local cache. And you can change this if you want, but we're not going to for GlobalMantics because this is a perfectly appropriate location for a cache. Finally, with BranchCache configured on a Windows 7 machine, there may come a time when you want to see how it's running. There are a couple of different ways to monitor BranchCache. One is to use another built-in netsh command, BranchCache show status all. The other way is to use performance monitor counters. Windows 7 includes more than 20 BranchCache related performance counters. The performance monitor, the tool that uses performance counters to count all of the performance needs of your Windows 7 machine, is covered in the lesson entitled Monitoring and Maintaining Windows 7. I am going to go over to a GlobalMantics desktop, and I'm going to run netsh BranchCache show status all, and we're also going to take a look at the Windows 7 performance counters that are available for use with BranchCache. And here we are once again on a GlobalMantics desktop, and you notice that I've already typed netsh BranchCache show status all at the command prompt. And you're going to see that there are a number of options that come up, or a number of pieces of information that come up with regard to how BranchCache operates when I use the show status all command. You're going to get information about the BranchCache service status, which we saw before, the local cache status as well, the publication cache status, and information about the networking status, including what items are configured and what items are required. You'll notice that the items that are marked as required, including peer discovery firewall rules, content retrieval firewall rules, and the content retrieval URL reservation, are all configured or enabled, and that's a good thing. You got to see the firewall rules get enabled when we did the enabling of BranchCache via the netsh command earlier in this lesson. Next, we have Performance Monitor, and we're going to take a quick peek at some of the Performance Monitor counters as they relate to BranchCache. We're not going to put together a full Performance Monitor template or chart, but you're going to get a look at all of the things that you can count when it comes to Performance Monitor and BranchCache. So in Performance Monitor, I'll right-click the graph and choose Add Counters. You're going to notice there's a number of available counter categories, and I'm going to move up the page here, and I'm going to find BranchCache that you can see right on your screen. I'm going to select a checkbox next to Show Description so we can get some information about some of the items that we can count using the Performance Monitor counters. Under BranchCache, you'll notice it says bytes from cache. Total number of bytes received from the local cache or peers. And this is the background intelligent transfer service. That's a service that runs under Windows that basically helps the transfer files in the background when nothing else is going on in the system. And I'm going to go a little lower here so we can see some other information. Here's some information about the bytes from cache, the total number of bytes that were received from the local cache or from peers, and bytes from server, the total number of bytes received from the original content source. Theoretically, if you add these two values together, that should be the total value for all of the files that you transferred from a particular system that day. So if you had 10 documents that all equal the meg, and you got some from cache and some from the original server, the total of those 10 documents should still be a meg, but from different sources. So this, if you look at these two counters on a chart, and you're using BranchCache, it can give you an idea of how efficient BranchCache is for you. Bytes received from cache for retrieval purposes. And then when we get down to SMB, using the SMB protocol again, this is server message block, that's how Windows talks to other Windows servers. Bytes from cache, bytes from server. Same thing that we saw before with bits. And then we have something similar for HTTP. And you're going to notice that there's just a bunch of counters that are available for you to be able to use in Performance Monitor as it relates to BranchCache. And if you just select the checkbox next to Show Description, you'll get a look at what all of the counters can do for you. We talked a lot about BranchCache in this lesson, but unfortunately there's not a lot to see. It is a very transparent tool. You can get some information via the performance counters, and you can see how much information has been read from the cache. But beyond that, users themselves don't see anything, and that's a good thing. The less the users see of the operations of a tool like this, the fewer calls you're going to get to the help desk, and that's a good thing for everybody. We started the lesson by talking about BranchCache at a high level and what it's for. We then talked about some client-side requirements, specifically that BranchCache requires the enterprise or ultimate versions of Windows 7, and requires that you have a Windows Server 2008 server configured as a BranchCache host or server. We discussed the BranchCache operating modes, which are hosted, distributed, and local. And then I talked to you a little bit about the local cache mode, and we talked about the fact that it's not really used that much, and the only way to configure your computer for local cache mode is to use the netsh command. You cannot do so with group policy. You then got to look at the BranchCache operational diagram, and we moved on to talk about BranchCache and how it works with group policy. We didn't spend a lot of time on that. We spent a lot of time on other group policy items in this course, so we focused on the netsh side of the house with BranchCache in this lesson. And you got to look at a number of netsh commands as they relate to BranchCache. We wrapped up by looking at two different ways that you can monitor BranchCache. One is to use another netsh command, and another one is to use the Performance Monitor tool that's built into Windows 7. There are a number of tools out there that you can use to learn more about BranchCache. The BranchCache Deployment Guide for Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7 is fantastic and tells you everything in depth about all of the underpinnings of BranchCache right down to the bit level of how it works. And BranchCache, helping you save on WAN bandwidth consumption at branch offices, is a fantastic presentation that you should watch to get even more information about BranchCache. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.